Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to move into the aftermath of World War I and discuss the effects of the Great War on American society and our attempt to return to somewhat of the status quo in the aftermath of the Great War. So let's dive in and talk about all of this stuff. So here's our basic objectives for today. Take a moment, take them in, and we'll move forward. World War I was, of course, an incredibly devastating conflict, and in the aftermath of the war, many countries were struggling to get by. Herbert Hoover, who, as you hopefully remember from last time, was the head of the U.S. Food Administration, is going to provide substantial relief to European countries, making himself an international celebrity and, of course, a rising star in American politics. So keep in mind Herbert Hoover's name. He's going to be important later, both for organizing our food during the war and also providing relief for Europeans after the war. We had talked last time about the Spanish flu pandemic, which is happening in the background here, devastating and disrupting society in the aftermath of this global conflagration. And so keep in mind, as we're talking about all of this, the Spanish flu is also happening. We're facing public shutdowns and huge amounts of people dying as a part of this. And so other things disrupting society were the Spanish flu, and, as you hopefully remember from your world history classes, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, was relatively preoccupied with his 14 points, which you should pause and definitely read if you don't remember them from world history, which he was trying to get the other delegates at the Paris Peace Conference to accept. So here's Woodrow angrily storming across the Atlantic Ocean to try to show those Europeans how peace should really be negotiated. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles, as you hopefully remember from world history classes, did not contain many of the 14 points. We did establish a League of Nations, but as far as the rest of it goes, the French really mostly wanted to punish the Germans. The British were kind of ambivalent about the whole process. The Germans were, of course, locked out of the peace treaty and peace negotiations, and the whole thing made Woodrow Wilson super upset. So, most of Wilson's 14 points not part of the final Treaty of Versailles. In general, what we found out of this whole deal is the League of Nations did happen. Most of the European countries were concerned with increasing their power, and so we see the whole site, although the Sykes-Picot Agreement never actually happened, we see European countries taking over the Middle East, which is going to become really important for us later. And in general, the lessons that we learned is if you win a war, you get to punish your enemies and steal their territory. So, neat. Even at the time, of course, people like John Maynard Keynes argued that this was utter nonsense and just paving the way for future wars. So take a moment and read Keynes's Economic Consequences of the Peace. But European countries were not listening at this point. They'd fought a horrible war, and they needed to show their constituents that this war was fought for something. Woodrow Wilson desperately wanted this League of Nations to happen, and so he was willing to sell this awful Versailles Peace Treaty to the American people, despite the fact that the only part of it that he really agreed with was the League of Nations thing. And so he went on a campaign around the country to try to sell this and stressed himself out so much that he had a stroke. Here he's laying out why the League of Nations is so important. And once Woodrow Wilson was bedridden, his wife Edith is going to run affairs secretly for about another year or for the next year of his presidency. The United States did not even go along with the Treaty of Versailles. Republicans in Congress specifically rejected the treaty, and we did not join the League of Nations. And so the United States had to negotiate our own separate treaty with Germany, not signing on to the Treaty of Versailles thing. So Wilson almost killed himself for this, and we didn't sign the treaty and we didn't join the League of Nations. So that should be noteworthy going forward. Here's Henry Cabot Lodge articulating why he hates the League of Nations. It's pretty straightforward. And honestly, you'd think Wilson would be on board with this whole America First thing. But again, he wasn't. League of Nations. In the aftermath of the war, demobilization was pretty problematic. I mean, you take the vast majority, or you take all of American society and focus it towards fighting a war, and then once that war's over, you've got to reorganize all of American society afterwards. It's super problematic. 4 million soldiers are sent home with $60 and a train ticket. That's not great. You've got to completely remake American industry. Not great there either. We're going to lead to the value of the dollar dropping, businesses going bankrupt, people losing their farms. And so not only do you have the suffering of World War I, not only do you have a global pandemic raging around the world, but you've got an economic recession at the same time. So all of this is going to lead to substantial unrest. During the war, of course, the National Labor Relations Board, headed by Taft, prevented the United States or prevented workers from going on strike. So after the war, with that removed, we're going to see a bunch of strikes. Steel workers are going to go on strike. Railroad workers are going to go on strike. More terrifying, police unions go on strike. And especially in Boston, the police just refuse to work, and the city falls into anarchy before the governor of Massachusetts, Calvin Coolidge, seizes control, fires the entire police staff, and restores order. But this demonstrates to people how uncertain things are and how unstable this whole situation is, especially because all of this worker unrest is happening exactly the same time that the Russian Revolution is continuing. As you again hopefully remember from your world history classes, the February Revolution overthrew the Tsar, but the October Revolution brought Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power. Currently, there was a civil war going on between the Red Army and the various white armies. The United States did get involved and send some troops up to Archangel in the north to ostensibly support some of the white forces, but in the end, we were snowed in. Americans did not participate in the Russian Civil War, and all it did was strain relations further between us and the Soviets. But all of this labor unrest convinced us that maybe the ideological contagion of the Russian Revolution had already infected the United States. So here's the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer describing the dangers of spreading communism. So pause and read. And we get what's called the Red Scare. This Red Scare was not totally unjustified. In addition to these labor strikes, there were a number of terrorist attacks. There was an explosion at J.P. Morgan's offices in Wall Street, killing people from an anarchist bomb. A. Mitchell Palmer survived several assassination attempts from various anarchists, and there were a variety of different attacks and murders by various Bolshevik factions, as various communists saw this as an opportunity to destabilize the American government. The Red Scare it's tough to say overreaction, but it was certainly a response to this whole thing. We start deporting communists, especially if they're foreigners, famously putting a bunch of former Russians on a boat to the Soviet Union. We're also going to deport other foreigners to other countries and start limiting immigration into the United States. And we're going to significantly increase the power of the FBI to investigate and throw all of these communists out of the country. Here's the bald eagle metaphorically cleaning the nest. And here's the effect of all of this. So take a moment, pause, read the effect on labor leaders. And we get what's called the Palmer raids. A. Mitchell Palmer, the Attorney General, is going to be sort of the figure behind a lot of this, and for most Americans, his actions were seen as justified. The arrests of communists, radicals, socialists, and foreigners was seen as a way to stop the disorder that had grabbed the country and usher in sort of peace and normalcy in the aftermath of World War I. So Palmer raids generally supported by the public, but of course, there was significant restrictions on civil liberties. Here's the effect of this on the American Communist Party and the international workers of the world. So pause, read. And it's going to destroy the American communist movement before it really takes root. And we're going to significantly increase the power of the FBI, and specifically J. Edgar Hoover, the guy who becomes sort of synonymous with domestic surveillance and spying. Probably the largest miscarriage of justice was the Sacco and Vanzetti case, where two foreigners were convicted and executed for murders that they almost certainly didn't commit because of their communist sympathies. And so there are some miscarriages of justice here, but most Americans saw these things as necessary. There was also a significant push to reform U.S. immigration law. Here's Henry Cabot Lodge laying out his vision for immigration. You can see here he's clearly, again, calling on these same nativist tropes and drawing a distinction between old and new immigrants. And so we're going to pass the National Origins Act to create a census of the population in the United States at this time. There's a real sense that we need to be limiting specific groups coming in, lest they change the culture of the United States or bring in dangerous ideas, radicalism, unrest, and terrorism. So we see clear propaganda here pushing for this. In the end, this lays out the sort of how we saw the differences between people. So pause, read the difference between old and new immigrants. And we're going to set up a quota system as part of this. What we do is take a census of the current ethnic population of the United States, the breakdown of various groups, and we're going to put in a 3% quota saying that 3% of the current population of that ethnic group can come in each year. The goal is to keep static the racial makeup of the United States. And so, for example, if there was 1,000 British people, 30 British people could come in. If there was 100 Norwegian people, 3 Norwegian people could come in. If there were only 7 Russian people, 0 Russians could come in. So the National Origins Act put heavy restrictions on immigration from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe. Ironically, it prevented a lot of dissidents from the Soviet Union from coming to the United States. And so, despite the fact that this was ostensibly to stop radicals from coming in, instead, they forced a lot of formerly sympathetic Russians to stay in the Soviet Union, where they're going to face horrific conditions under Lenin and then eventually Stalin. So, that's somewhat problematic. And it's going to completely ban Asian immigrants. So here's Emmanuel Seller's argument against the immigration law. But in general, most support was given for these quotas. And what's going to happen to immigration reform over time is we're mostly going to cut down the quotas and further restrict immigration. This was our first major restriction of immigrants that weren't the Chinese. And yeah, we're going to continue along this path. Women are going to get suffrage during this time period. We're going to see increased picketing outside the White House by women and other suffrage groups, pushing back against the Wilson administration, who were using sort of the image of German despotism to build support for the war. And at the same time, Wilson's self-determination does not apply to American women. We're also going to see a combination of sort of civil disobedience, hunger strikes, and attempts to build support. So pause, read, move forward. And as a result of this, especially the actions of Alice Paul, the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. The 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. It was ratified by all of these states, and now women can vote in national elections. It was a huge step forward and is going to be one of the landmark amendments in American history. As far as Black people go, it does not go quite as well. Southerners had been building propaganda against civil rights for a while. We briefly talked about the birth of a nation and Wilson's support for the Jim Crow South. As we talked about last time, W.E.B. Du Bois argued that Black people should go serve in the military in order to get their rights afterwards. And so African American soldiers returned from Europe, where they were generally treated well by most Europeans, they come back to a country that expected them to go back into segregation and subjugation. These Black soldiers resented the fact that they couldn't eat at the same restaurants as white people, and they resented the discrimination that they found within northern cities. Du Bois was extremely upset that although Black people did decide to take his first part at face value and go serve the country did not provide rights for Black people in the aftermath, and the lack of support for civil rights led him to become increasingly bitter. So pause and read Du Bois' tract to returning soldiers. In the end, this led to what's called the Red Summer. In order to reestablish the status quo, we saw incredibly violent racial riots in many American cities, with predominantly white mobs attacking Black people, Black businesses, Black neighborhoods, Black institutions, things like that. We saw major race riots and lynchings in all of these places, both across the Jim Crow South and also the North. And this is to some degree also connected with the whole Tulsa race massacre that has become popular and famous, because of the whole Watchmen series. And so that, although that happened in 1921, it is similarly connected to all of this. All of these race riots more or less forced Black people back into sort of a subservient position and really stymied the push for civil rights going forward. And so, although women got the 19th Amendment in the aftermath of World War I, there was no significant push for Black civil rights, at least at the national level. And this, of course, sort of convinced Black people that they would need to organize and continue to push for rights going forward. That brings us to the end of the disorder in the aftermath of World War I. For next time, we're going to talk about the way in which Black culture and Black identity flourished, and we're going to talk about how other American cultural movements continued to grow as we move into the time period known as the Roaring Twenties. Thank you for listening.